So this topic is the pre-tests explained. If you caught the talk this morning, it will be basically the same content. But do sit around for it because we'll, I'm sure, cover a slightly different angle. I'm delighted to be joined by Will Petty, who's director at Bonas MacFarlane. Will ran tuition at Bonas MacFarlane for a long time, but really is a consultant, and so he has a strategic angle he can bring to this topic as well as the tuition side of it. And Jason Zhou, director at Think Academy, and they'll both introduce themselves in a second. How many people here caught one of the senior schools talking about whether your child would thrive at an academic London school? Yeah, most people, yeah. So what we're trying to unpick here, I don't know, I didn't catch the afternoon one. In the morning, when I was outside with the heads talking beforehand, they were talking about how against tuition they were and how untutorable the 11 plus tests are. And we're basically going to unpick that a bit and talk about what's really involved in these tests and how people prepare for them. And a lot of what schools say about them isn't really quite right and needs to be challenged a bit, I think. So just to kick things off, Will, do you want to talk a little bit about Bonas MacFarlane and what it does with preparing children for them?
Sure, thanks, Guy. So at Bonas MacFarlane, we sort of have our tuition business, which is the oldest part of our business, dates back to the mid-90s, depending on what stage of the evening you ask Child Bonus, that was established. And then as we met David, who's sort of behind the shows and came up with that idea, we got together and co-founded the consulting company, and we specialise there in placing children of any age into the independent school sector from any background. A lot of our business comes from overseas, so quite often we found ourselves in a position where we're explaining things from a knowledge base of absolutely zero. They're not in the system yet, they don't live here, they don't have the luxury of the grapevine that you might have as a London parent, even if you're not yet in the independent sector. And we guide them through the entire process from start to finish. And in fact, when we start with students doing that, it's very much a turnkey project sort of style model. So we take them from the very beginning and not knowing what they want to do and when, to the child accepting a place and attending a school. And when we do that, we often start, if they're of age, by which I mean 7-ish and above of assessment age, we use the industry standard ed-psych assessments like the WIAT, the WISC, and the RAT, to assess these children and get a baseline. Now, those are very detailed, and they give you a 12-page report, but essentially they're measuring the similar things to pre-test, i.e. they're a cognitive function test. They're telling you as a parent how your child's brain works and how they learn best. So that's always been our angle when we get to the right age groups. Obviously, it doesn't apply to nursery school and reception entry, but from sort of 7 and 8 plus onwards, it's an incredibly powerful tool. And it's also really powerful as your child is looking to go towards these now quite common pre-tests. That's a very bad use because one of them is called the common pre-test, but there's more than one of these pre-tests around. There's a few brands doing them, and it gives you a real insight into how your child is going to do in those.
Thanks, Will. And Jason, do you want to explain a little bit about Think?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jason. I'm the director of Think Academy. Think Academy was founded in 2003 with a specific focus on maths tuition. And ever since then, in 2018, we became the world's biggest education company and helped over 40 million students worldwide. Now we're in 9 different countries, including the UK. And something that we focus only in the UK is exam prep and competition prep. We help very talented and gifted children to really push their ceiling and to realize what their potential can be. That's been lacking in our the UK's existing education system. And especially in the UK, we have about 3,000 pupils. And last year, 98% of our pupils passed the first round of testing. And in terms of our results, we have 115 offers from the top 50 schools. So we're very proud with our results, and we're very proud to say that it is working. What we're doing is working.
Great. So 2 very qualified people there to start talking to us about these pre-tests. So I'm going to start with Will. Will's been around a while, not as long as me. I'm really quite ancient, and I was teaching in a West London prep school as head of English and senior teacher in the early 90s, when we would prepare students for St Paul's and Westminster scholarships, and they just took them at 13, and there was no pretest. So the term pretest relates to these 13 plus or 11 plus for girls, as it was at the time, tests that people took, and the pre bit of it was before the main thing. But that's not what they are anymore, is it? So do you want to explain now sort of a little bit of why they came in and how they function now?
Yeah, so as Guy points out, when they first came out, the pre-test was to sort of distinguish them from... the very first came out, actually, it was a couple of schools who did them independently, so they had their own test designed to use in-house. So no other school was sharing the same thing. It was the likes of the very big names like Eton and Harrow were the first to the table. And the pre-test bit was to sort of distinguish them from the inevitable common entrance that was still the norm then, which, as Guy points out, you did in the first week of June in all subjects. It takes 4 days, 5 if you did ancient Greek. And that still carries on, but it's not very fashionable anymore. Lots of schools, senior schools, have dropped the requirement for it completely. And those schools that had these sort of their in-house pre-tests, as they called them, then that caught on, and then there was a need for, in fact, the ISCB, who published Common Entrance, and also one of the most prolific pre-tests that we have, which is the Common ISCB pre-test. Really, education is the place to come for short titles and no acronyms. And when that came in, there was a hilarious moment when my former school, Harrow, actually called the pre-test, they were still using the pre-test, and then they had their own pre-test, and then they had Common Entrance. Luckily, things have simplified now. But the pre-test, most schools using it, there are exceptions to everything, as there are all through independent education in this country. No one does the same thing. Everyone's got their own set of rules. Every phrase can have a different meaning, even if it's shared by the same group. The pre-test usually is used by boarding public schools very, very often to distinguish itself from their own in-house test. So it's an original screener at the very top end of selective schools. That happens in the autumn of year 6. And at that same top end, you could be back at that, well, not back at that school. You do the pre-test at your current school. You don't go to the destination school that you're applying to. You do that at your current school. And those destination schools use that as a screener, effectively. So Eton's numbers are something like they'll have maybe up to 2,000 boys doing that, and they will come right down to about 600 students that they'll take through to their own tests. Another school, for instance, will use it as a much, much lighter screener, so they might have the similar, but they'll only come down to, say, 1,000 students at that point. Anyway, whichever way they go, it's the test that you do away from the school without any contact, remotely at your current school. And then if you pass their threshold, whatever that might be, all of which is kept private, by the way, you don't find out the results yourself either, you are then invited to the school's own test, which these days is normally called things like imaginative, like the Harrow test, the Eton test, the Wellington Assessment Day, whatever it might be. Then the Common Entrance by that point is largely academic, and forgive the terrible pun there, wasn't actually intended. But you're given a conditional offer after that second test, the in-school test. And so if schools are still using Common Entrance, which many are not, they're certainly not requiring it, they do it purely for streaming purposes. So it's, whether you get in or not is a done deal, and that final run of exams is to figure out what set you should be in for each subject.
Thanks, Will. That's really helpful. Before we go on to, I've got quite a few sort of... We're going to deep dive a bit into what these tests are, but just a timeline thing is very interesting. So this morning, Adam Pettit from Highgate was saying, we were asking the question of how do you decide whether your child is suited to an academic school, and Adam said, oh well, you know, in year 5, towards the end of year 5, you want to be talking to their teacher about whether they would suit a highly academic London school. And of course, quite soon after that, in the autumn term, you're doing the pre-test.
Yeah.
So if you had actually left it that late, you'd be giving yourself about 3 months of preparation. So what would you say would be a more normal timeline? Let's take it from the BM point of view, and then.
I'm often heard saying that really, you want to be thinking about this stuff in year 4. What you don't want at any point in your sort of making decisions for your child's future pathway is to get in a position where you're doing the kitchen sink at the last minute. Time is the greatest weapon, and it gives you the greatest opportunity to sort of suss things out, do a bit of window shopping, physical window shopping of the schools. But as Guy points out, waiting right and up until that point to ask. And at most, even the smartest private prep school, the head won't sit you down and talk about future schools until year 5. Hopefully the beginning of year 5, but I think really you should get your eye in at the end of year 4, talk about it across the summer, maybe start a bit of prep with your children. There are lots of great products and businesses out there offering ways of getting your child used to these tests and certainly exercising the skills they're going to require. But definitely year 4 is when I would be doing an assessment proper, one that comes with a report from a reputable company like ourselves, and finding out really where your child's at. Your school reports are not going to cut it. They're pretty general in prep school, the prep school sort of lifespan. They say things like, he's doing really well. Not very helpful, which is fair enough, by the way. I don't expect or demand that these schools are producing too much sort of loads of data, because actually all of that slows down good, natural teaching. And it kind of robs kids of a school experience and a bit of a childhood, and they're constantly being put through this and that. But just getting an objective snapshot doesn't have to be hugely expensive. There are some online ones, although that most of those just spit out numbers. If you really want to sort of get behind it and understand where your child's at and what needs to be focused on, you do need a proper sort of more coherent industry standard test like the ones I mentioned earlier. And that's a really valuable investment and affordable, we're planning to almost everybody. And it will get you, proper feedback from a real human about what they saw, not just what the data says. So you get analysis plus anecdotal observational information, all of which is really, really valuable. And then that helps you to plan. And then you go and listen to the schools, in the open days as that year carries on into year 5, and sort of try and marry those two things together. So the knowledge you have, definitely listen to school, definitely ask the form teacher, definitely speak to your head. One of the modern manifestations, which is a bit of an issue, is that a lot of parents have decided you don't, if your head teacher doesn't tell you what you like, you do your own thing anyway. No. If your head teacher doesn't tell you what you want to hear, I'm afraid you probably need a bit of reality check. There may be some exceptions where, the head has got it wrong completely, or, they're being a bit harsh on your child and they haven't factored in he or she might develop a bit more sort of profoundly in those formative years. For instance, in boys, we're late developers. My first wife would argue still going for me. That is actually sort of scientifically true, and you can't write people off on these tests just because of certain grades at quite a young age. But you do have to be realistic, and if the professionals who are academically in front of your kids and seeing that happen over a period of years, that is not generally advice you should ignore. And pushing it too far down that road, overdoing the tuition, all of these things are really bad news, and they don't work, and they're often very destructive, not just not constructive, but destructive to your child's learning path, perhaps your relationship in extreme circumstances with them. So, do listen to the professionals, do a bit of a deeper dive outside of school, a bit of an objective view that's just looking at that testing and that cognitive function. And then, like all these things, take a balanced view of everything that you find, then go and do some homework, physically visiting the schools, listening to what they're saying, what they demand, matching that up. And this is always dodgy in a room full of parents, but try not to listen to each other too much. Other parents, or as I call it, the noise, are quite dangerous. Unless they're at the school that you're looking at, that's all they know about. Yeah. And rumours spread like wildfire, so please listen to professionals, not just each other.
So I'm going to start speeding you up, Will, because we want to try and whiz round the topic and have time for questions. Jason, Will says you start ideally in year 4. What do you think in terms of maths preparation? When will you start doing?
From our perspective, I actually agree with a lot of what Will said in terms of the communication with the school. From our experience, our best advice is to start as early as possible. Now, That's a very broad and very vague statement, and I'll break it down into it for two reasons. The first one, from our experience, there's two main types of ways to get your grades up. The first one is a more Singaporean style, which essentially involves where a child studies a few years ahead of what they need to do, the knowledge points from 2 or 3 years from onwards, but they actually don't go very deep, they're very shallow, but they cover a lot of bases. Another way is a more British, Western American style, is you study the knowledge points for the year group, but you go very deep. You go a deep dive into that specific knowledge point. Now, both of them, they have their pros and cons. The first one, if you want to increase your, go up your grades, you do something called question laundering. It's a direct translation, which means that you do the same type of questions over and over and over again until a point where it becomes the child's muscle memory. Now, the risk with that is that you might risk a burnout. So, especially when it comes to exam prep, closer up to the year 2, year 5, year 6, parents are getting nervous, and then the child is getting nervous, everyone's getting nervous. Then there's a lot of pressure, and there you risk a burnout with the question laundering. But that is essentially if the child is at 100, if the top mark for the child is at 100, you're trying to push him or her to get as close to that 100 as possible. That's what happens with question laundering. Now, the second way, which is much more, long-term, and this is something that we believe in, is developing interest from a very young age. Now, the thing about maths fear of maths in the UK is actually very high. There's a study done, 59% of the pupils either say they're bored with maths, or they're scared of math, or say that their math is not so good. It's very high. Now, and that all comes from interest at a very young age. If you develop interest, gamify the content, make each topic understandable to a younger person, they develop an interest, there's a sense of a reward, there's a sense of achievement, they'll be addicted to the feeling of getting better and better and better at a subject. And that way, you're looking beyond the test, you're looking beyond 11 plus, 13 plus. You're developing an interest, and they will proactively start to want to learn more, start to want to do more on that specific topic. What we do specifically is from year 1 to year 3, we have our own course development team develop our courses for year 1 and 3 to make sure that they are gamified, they're interesting, and they're suitable for children that age. But at the same time covering all of the knowledge points that you might get in your pretest, in your 11 plus, in your 13 plus exams later on. Now, from year 4, it becomes slightly more serious. The course development team will go through all the topics in a much easier way, covering the basics, the foundation, laying the foundation. And at the end of year 4 and starting year 5, you'll really go into the nitty-gritty, the details of it. So from our perspective, if you're looking beyond the test, if you want to develop it as an interest, if you want to push forward, not focusing on the competition now, but focusing on competition later, you're looking at that. And this way, if you're pushing the ceiling. So the child, let's say before we mentioned if it's at 100, the ability is 100, instead of trying to get him to 100 as possible, close to 100 as possible, you're pushing that envelope higher. So it doesn't matter where this is, the ability is higher, which gives you a much easier way, much quicker route to further maths to harder math questions later on, i.e. GCSE or A-levels.
Thanks, Jason. I mean, so effectively, Will and Jason there have just laid out the perfect parenting route. what you should have done. Let's find out where people actually are at. If this room's remotely like my household, you've probably all got children in year 5. So who's currently got a child in year 5? Yeah, about half the room. And then year 4? Year 3? Okay. All right, so for year 3s, you can start feeling a bit smug. All of that made loads of sense. But if you're year 5, don't panic. Because actually, no one... I mean, what's been laid out is like the perfect way of doing it. And the financial planning people say, oh, you should have signed up for the financial plan like before the child was born. You want to get one ready for next year? Forget it. But actually, there's always something you can do.
Yeah.
And the thing is that I mean, last-minute cramming is really, really effective. So let's spin it a different way around, Will. We could put your tutoring hat on. You know that loads of families come to BM with like 3 weeks to go till the GCSEs.
Yeah.
And something useful happens. So tell us that story.
Yeah, so obviously long run-ups are great. Most of us are quite busy as parents. I've got children of my own. They're in year 5. I've done almost nothing about their senior school entry. I mean, I'm not even joking, I've almost nothing. And part of that actually comes from being slightly sort of battle-weary in the industry. And I'm at an age now where my own mates are asking me for advice, or at least clients who've been with me for a really long time and pay me loads of money, and then they come back and they say, "Go on, but what is the real secret?" Don't panic. It really is a secret, and there is nothing wrong with getting into year 6. That's when you start quickly and getting it together. I mean, that's too late, but it doesn't mean it's too late to get started. And as Guy says, if you do, and I did all my school revision at the last minute, and it went really well, because there was this sort of energy to be like, well, it must get done now, and that can keep you going. And also, the children at that point, they're pretty young in year 4. They're not going to care about too much. They shouldn't, hopefully, if they're at a school that's doing things right. They should be just enjoying their social life, doing their homework properly, but not really worrying about really boring multiple choice tests that they're going to have to do 18 months hence. And you certainly can't train them on those tests and do practice tests all that time because, as Jason mentions, you get this burnout. They see one of those and they're just like, nah, forget it. And as soon as they're out of the game, you've got a real uphill struggle. So there is something to be said, actually, for leaving things a bit last minute and really going for it. And then, like, a lot of our business is in that category because, of course, people go, oh, we're just really last minute. We're going to need help now. We're not going to do it on our own. But I don't think that many parents want to do it on their own. I had one go at tutoring my son when he was in reception, and within 5 minutes I was like, okay, I knew when I was a tutor that I was never going to do this with my own children. I don't know why I let their mother beat me into this. We're not doing this again. And so now we're friends again, or at least, enjoying being parent and child, and not me telling him what to do mathematically. It's just about being organised at that point. You should leave the test prep itself in terms of practicing the types of questions right to the end anyway. Because as I say, it's really dull. They're not very interesting, and you should be working on their foundational skills, their concepts, the stuff that's enjoyable to learn. As Jason points out, when they are doing that, they're gamifying things. They're making them exciting in that context. If you don't do all that stuff, it's really difficult. So keeping those interesting big concepts going all the way, then listening to your school with that future schools chat in year 5. And maybe that's the reason why some of these schools do leave it late and don't encourage you to do it earlier, because they're trying to protect the education for as long as they can, so you're not in school having to kowtow to parent pressure and do endless prep for everybody. If you're going to do last minute, it's just about being organised. Perhaps, if you're really last minute, definitely getting some professional help to guide you so you don't have to take on that pressure as well, and just making sure it's targeted. But all tests are, to a degree, crackable. And it's a question of, either figuring out yourself as a parent and using the resources available, or going to professionals like Think Academy or Bonas, MacFarlane, and getting someone in to really help you with that. It doesn't have to be really expensive and for the whole period. You can just bite off a little bit and then carry it on yourself. There's nothing like a bit of advice, see how it's done, and then you can carry it on.
Yes, and sorry to, if it's in a situation, if your child is in year 5 or year 6 and they're desperate, they need to cram it, launder that question as much as possible. If that was the situation, I was talking about the interest from very early on, that you have the time. That's why I mentioned prepare as early as you can. If you have the luxury of the time to prepare, great. If you don't, the best way is to launder, and that sounds so wrong, but you have to, do as many as possible. That's definitely the way to do it, and that's proven so many times, and that's why the Asian kid next door gets such good grades. Literally, that's the way to do it.
I think there's a lot to be said too for boiling stuff down to like 1 page of what you need to learn before the exam. If you can do that, you can pass almost any exam. I'm going to spin before we throw to questions on the floor. I was going to spin it a slightly different way around, which is, one thing we've discovered is most of the room here have got children who are year 5, and so you're in that final run actually. The key thing is to find a way to lift your stress away from your child, and no one performs well if they feel the parent's stress. I mean, actually, the thing that most children most don't want to do is disappoint you, on the whole. and if they feel like them getting into a particular school is what really counts for you, that isn't likely to improve their performance.
No, and if you're thinking that not talking about it is all you need to do, that's not enough, right? They can sniff it in the air. And it's things like we say a lot, the day that they're going to these tests, don't make a fuss. Whoever takes them to school takes them to the test. Don't get dressed in a different outfit. You just don't. Don't sort of quiz them every night the week it's happening. Like, what have you done? What do you do at school? All of that stuff, even just the look will do it. And that's something to be said for leaving things to the last minute, because, if you're a bit more chilled out about it, so will they be. And these pre-tests are psychometric. They're, to a degree, measuring their God-given ability. You can improve on making sure they're hitting their potential on the day, but, psychometric means what it says on the tin.
I think the worst thing that, in terms of stress, that a parent can do is simply set your child with a goal. You say, okay, Jimmy, you've got to get an A star here, and full stop. Because goals, or what in our company we call it objective key results, is for adults. Once I have my goal, I have to find ways to do that. But at that age, it just becomes a stressful thing. The goal's here, you're here, you haven't figured out a way on your own how to get there. The best way is not to set a goal, but to set small little targets day by day. What should we do today? What should we do today? And the parents being there, taking that journey with the child, is the most important thing, and the most is good for you and good for your child as well. The journey is what matters, and communication with the school, seeing how they're doing. Effective communication is so important.
Something also that Will just said that sparks thought about both of you is that he's talking about helping his own kids and how difficult that is. It's very difficult to teach your children. That's why children go to school, and why home learning is only for the few, really. It's extremely hard to teach your children because you're meant to love them and care about them, and
it muddies the water for what they would really rather you were doing.
And so the reason why people have tutors is not because they're abdicating their responsibility, but because actually a lot of parents actually can't teach their children, isn't it? It's as simple as that.
Neither of my parents could do maths at all, which is, so they couldn't teach me that for a start, so that was off the table. But yeah, there's a lot you need to do as a parent, and having to do this as well, frankly, is, at this stage, is getting too tricky and a step too far. Don't just think about the amount of innate teaching you do when they're at home before they go to nursery. It's all you're doing, pointing at things and telling them what they're called. You do that for the solid first 4 years without question. With all you get a little bit of support from nursery, but it's a matter of hours a week compared to formal schooling. So you've done your bit, and they get to this point. Unless you're in the game, and even then, as I've just said, that doesn't help. It's really hard to do, and you're probably better off focusing on the bigger things like, the kind of person they're becoming socially, the kind of company they're keeping, the kind of behaviour they think is acceptable, than you are with their maths and their literacy.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to avoid a personal anecdote now. Any questions? We've got a brilliant. We've got the microphone. Actually, have we got the microphone? Oh, yes, we have. Great.
Hi, my son is coming from a state school and he's in year 5, and I know we will get no help from the head teacher in terms of guidance about schools. Obviously we can practice online for these tests, but do you have any feel, based on your years of experience, on the type of scores that he would need to progress to the second round in somewhere like Westminster or St Paul's? Because, as I say, we'll get no guidance.
Yeah, so you've got to be a bit careful, because these tests that you can practice tests that you can do will give you standardised scores, but that doesn't mean they're standardised across each and every test. They're standardised within that sample group of that particular test. You will hear, or you do hear these days, and these schools like Westminster have allowed, understandably, these rumours to spread because they're semi-useful, is that there's no point really applying unless, in the summer holidays before you're about to do it, that you're scoring 120 on average, standardised score across the whole lot. Bearing in mind on your typical standardised test, the sort of bottom is 80 and the absolute statistical max is between 140 and 145 depending on the test. That's the bit of the bell curve where the bell's nearly touching the axis on the right-hand side if you're looking at it. So very few kids have got it, and after that, it's statistically unverifiable. So, if you're not comfortably getting past 120, yeah, it's worth having a little bit of a check and thinking, if you're in that sort of grey area, go to a professional outfit that has an in-person assessment that's properly recognised by the industry, like the ones I mentioned. Invest should be about between £300 and £600, depending on what you're doing and what you're getting, with an ed psych, and get a proper written report that tells you everything that it really breaks things down a bit. Those scores, A, will be much more accurate than things you find online, okay, because they're delivered by a human, not a machine. B, you're going to get stuff you can really use for their tuition and development. But if you're getting, very much, say, around 100 to 110, those schools are not for you.
Well, this morning, St Paul said 130.
Well, quite. So 120, don't think about it, but if you look at the people getting in, it's 130. A bit like universities say your basic entry requirement. That doesn't mean that's what people are getting. That means you need to get that to be looked at, to be successful, a category above. And
I think the thing to bear in mind, though, is that it can seem like this is a real kind of like the future of your child's life in this school. It's rubbish. I mean, like what these tests measure is your ability to do this kind of test, and that and what that shows, and that's what schools use to let people in. That doesn't mean that your child is or isn't clever, is or isn't going to have a brilliant career. It just shows that they can do these tests. IQ was shown massively devalued about 30 years ago for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely right. I saw a girl's assessment. She's in year 10, so she's looking at sixth form entry, so slightly different kettle of fish, but she went through the age-appropriate psychometric test, and it's showing at the moment that, she's quite an average. And you look at her school reports and everything else, and actually, because these tests aren't really that good when it comes to understanding how people do in public examinations, she's getting predicted 8s and 9s in GCSEs, which are the top 2 grades in almost all her subjects, bar maths and science. And in these tests, obviously, maths is half of it, and she's terrible at it. She's just innately not good at it, hates it, doesn't like it, isn't naturally, attuned to it. And that's bringing the whole thing down and making her look like an average student. She's anything but an average student. It's going to do incredibly well. And because someone sat down and saw through that, she's going to get the right advice. So, again, you've got to be careful. And great line from Guy. Those tests only really tell you how well they're going to do in that test. It's those tests that these schools have chosen to be a rough marker of academic performance. But plenty of those children who do really well will go on and not do so well in the 5 or 7 years they're at that senior school.
I think from so many parents that we've seen and spoken to in the past, and they really focus, it's very easy to focus on what's now, here and now. Now is the time to get into a great secondary school. Now is the time to do this test. But more and more so, I think the recommendation I would love to give, and for parents to have the patience to have, is the view of a child's education as a long-term, a much wider perspective. Because when I was going through the same situation, a while ago, every 11 plus, my parents said to me, Jason, this is a life-changing moment in your life. GCSE, my parents said, Jason, this is a life-changing moment. A-levels, Jason, this is a life-changing. Every single time, because it's always about the there and now. But bear in mind that it's not about, your competition is not those around you now. Is the wider society, is what other people are doing, is what they're not doing, is what they are doing, is what the same university space that you're trying to fight for, is the same employment space that you're trying to fight for. So it's not about the here and now. And some people, like myself, I tend to mature much later. I recently matured, but I mean, not even that much, but I like to think I have. But people mature at different rates. And I think that's so important to understand as well, and not to focus on the here and now.
Yeah. And I think on that maturity thing, neurodevelopmental journeys are very variable from child to child, not from gender, just between the genders, and you've got to take all that into account.
Okay, question over here.
Oh, an actual student.
What would be the most important subject for any test, like GCSEs or A-level or SATs?
Great question. Jason?
I would say math is the most important subject. Yeah, but I think what you meant is which of those tests is most important. My answer is they're important to an extent that they're not important. Now that sounds like rubbish, but hear me out. I didn't do very well on my A-levels. and my GCSEs were okay, my common entrance were okay. But now I'm doing the things that I'm doing because of the person that I have become. It's not about, a test doesn't define you as a person. It should never define you as a person. And if someone uses a test to define you, they're wrong. You who defines you as a person is who you are, your character, what you want to do, what your aspirations are, how much hard work you're putting in, your dedication, your personality. All those things build who you are. And so that goes back to my original answer. They're important to an extent that they're not important.
I think, I mean, I happen to notice you by miles, you're the youngest member of the audience, and you were reading a book before it started. That's just wonderful. Like if you can get pleasure from things, if you see, you know, if you read, if you like maths, if you like problems, if you like thinking about things, and you get pleasure from it, in the end, that will sustain you.
Yeah, and do more of that.
It's very easy to get caught up in the hoops of tests. The whole thing is about one test after another. For long-term academic success or career success, there's got to be something that nourishes you about it. If you do the whole thing on fear, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, which is going back to sort of, you know, what both of us are saying with burnouts or being, destructive or deconstructive. You can get to that point really easily.
Let me ask.
One last question here, then we'll do quick. Could you just wait for the mic so we can all hear them?
Hi there. 2 questions in one. After the COVID, there is a lot of tuition centers across the country. So those tuition centers, because your lack of the education system is falling down, or there is a lack of...
I'm unaware of any meaningful data that there are definitely tuition centres that have directly in response to COVID.
For 11 plus, I mean. A lot of tuition centres for 11 plus.
I'm afraid they've been on a steady growth for a very long time, and that's not going to go anywhere. It's big business. I've looked at this, and I'm not unconvinced that a lot of it has necessarily come out of COVID. Is your question about sort of them struggling with concentration?
Now also, if those centres, are they accurate? The service provided, are they accurate with all the 11 plus, really?
I mean, who knows?
Are they meeting the curriculum?
If you're talking about a specific, they don't all follow the same thing. They're not the same people or the same institution. So I'm afraid, you'd have to look at them one by one, and you'd have to make a judgment. And that's what's quite difficult as a parent. They will all say the same things, and you need to make a call on whether you find that verifiable. You need to look at their history, testimonials, Trustpilot, things like this. Perhaps friends who've used them, but I can't answer that question on the whole industry without investigating further.
So government has no control on them at all. It's like normal business.
No, I don't personally run a tuition centre with where we have people in, but my understanding is if you tutor people within a premises, yes, you are regulated, but regulation tends to be about things like fire exits and how many students you can have in one room and how many parents or the teachers having disclosure and barring checks and that kind of thing. In terms of the content of the teaching, that's the kind of thing that comes under Ofsted, and I don't think tuition centres are subjected to that in the same way that schools are. Yeah. So when you go down that route, you are making some, as a parent, it's up to you to figure out whether those are the right centres to go to.
It's more about things like safeguarding and so on. Now, we're actually, sadly, we have run out of time, but and this show is kind of closing. But I suspect if you wanted to catch Will or Jason outside,
better run quickly.
Do have a go.
Thank you, everybody.